Thank you, Bruce, and good morning, everyone. My name is Bill Tavares, and I'm the Communications Manager for the Preservation Society of Newport County. And today I'm sitting in for regular host Trudy Cox as we go inside the Newport Mansions with our guest, Thomas Ruys Smith. Thomas is an academic and writer who specializes in the study of 19th century America. He's a professor of American literature and culture at the University of East Anglia in the UK, where he joins us today. And he's published and edited books on a wide variety of subjects from Mark Twain and the Mississippi River to the history of American bestsellers. He's also one of the leading experts on the literary and cultural history of Christmas, which is why we have him here today. He's published two books in that field, Christmas Past, an Anthology of Seasonal Stories from 19th Century America in 2021, and The Last Gift, The Christmas Stories of Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Today, we're going to focus on Christmas Past, an anthology of seasonal stories from 19th century, seasonal stories from 19th century America. So welcome, Tom.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. What's it like over there? What's the weather like in
it's quite Dickensian. It's cold. It's a bit foggy. No snow yet here, but snow in other parts of the country.
Christmassy yet?
Yeah. I think people are going earlier with their Christmas lights this year, so so it's looking quite festive.
Well, I am so excited to have you here today, especially, obviously it's the perfect time of the year to have you, but I loved Christmas Past. It's such an interesting collection of stories. It's educational. It's just really a fascinating collection. And the obvious first question is, how many stories did you review before choosing what you chose for your collection?
That is a good question. Oh, I'm so glad you enjoyed it as well. Well, probably, certainly hundreds, maybe more. Obviously, one of the pleasures of this project was that there are so many Christmas stories to choose from. But that was also part of the motivation for the project as well, because despite the fact that Christmas literature was a ubiquitous part of the season for, the whole of the 19th century, really, certainly from about 1820 onwards, I really felt that there hadn't been enough attention paid to the way that Christmas literature helped to shape the season and the way that Christmas literature developed over the 19th century, shaping traditions and ideas that still are right at the heart of our celebrations today. So it was a labor of love, definitely. I'd been thinking about it for years as a possible project, but it was actually during the first COVID lockdown over here that I decided that this was the time to actually immerse myself in festive stories from the past as a bit of escapism, but also because I had some time to really dig into lots of old journals and magazines. So yes, it was a really enjoyable collection to put together, and certainly required me to sift through a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I can only imagine how much you had to sift through. How did you approach your research, and what was your idea about how you wanted to sort of organize this anthology?
I definitely wanted to show a sort of I'm not sure progression is the right word, but I wanted to show that sense of change over time, the way that you can see a very recognizable Christmas emerging on the page across the 19th century. So I definitely wanted to have that sense of chronological sweep within it, because it would be easy to cluster, around the Gilded Age, around the 1880s, 1890s, when that kind of publishing explosion takes place in American life, and you can't move for Christmas stories. But I really wanted to give people a clear sense of how we got there. So I knew that I would probably start with something like Washington Irving's account of Christmas, which is one of the more famous and pivotal pieces of Christmas writing in the American canon, and that was a good starting point. And I also wanted to make it clear that the way that Americans wrote about Christmas really tracked across the national story in the 19th century as well. I think going into looking at antiquarian Christmas stories, I think people might suspect that Christmas in the 19th century was different from our times in the idea that Christmas would probably be kept apart from political debates or religious debates or moral debates more broadly, but absolutely not. From the moment that Christmas starts to be reinvigorated as a force in American life, it's immediately embroiled in all of the big conversations that are taking place across America. So I wanted to make sure that the stories reflected that national story as well.
And I think that's something that when we were talking before, I thought was really interesting is, the idea that the Christmas wasn't removed from the issues of the day even back then.
Yeah.
And I want to get into a little bit of that a little bit later in this interview about this idea of the magical Christmas past and the fact that Christmas was only recently commercialized. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I guess one of just looking at the sheer tonnage of great stories in anthology, one of the things I guess and I know this is your field, so I'm sure you were aware of everybody that you included in this, but were there stories or authors that you would have described maybe upon rereading these pieces as maybe a bit of a discovery? And I know you've got another book with a collection of short stories by Mary Wilkins Freeman, but were there people like Mary Wilkins Freeman that maybe you went back and revisited a story you were familiar with and said, you know what, this hits me a little bit different, or this resonates differently?
Yes.
Maybe a discovery.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think Mary Wilkins Freeman, who you've mentioned, is probably the best example because, I was already a fan of her writing. I was aware she'd done some Christmas stuff, and I really thought going into this that she would definitely claim a place in this collection immediately. But what I was not aware of was just how deep her Christmas writing went. So whilst working on this, I uncovered dozens of stories Christmas stories that Mary Wilkins Freeman wrote, and they're all, I would say all of them have some merit to them and could claim a spot in this collection, which is why I produced that sequel collection, as you mentioned, just dedicated to her work. So I think in a sense she is probably my favorite figure from this collection, just because what she manages to do with Christmas stories, I think, is unrivaled in the American canon. She takes the stock ingredients of Christmas that were developed by the late 19th century, and she's always able to do something interesting with them. She roots her stories in everyday American lives in this period, and uses that Christmas not just as a backdrop, but the fundamentals of it and the way that works in the emotional lives of her characters. The way she does that, I think, is quite remarkable. So she was definitely a highlight. I think it was a real pleasure to realize just how deep her Christmas list goes, if you like. But I think there are other figures in there as well. I mean, in a sense, all of them represent a surprise of some kind, because it was that I think I was looking for, something that stands out for some reason, that really defines a moment, but also, pushes things forward or, does something different. So, I've got Harriet Beecher Stowe in here, who we might think of course, as the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but a short story that she wrote before that, in 1850, a couple of years before she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, about Christmas, quite early, really, in the development of Christmas literature. And we're probably all familiar with the opening of Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Christmas won't be Christmas without presents. But what the story I've actually included in here is one of Louisa May Alcott's writings about being a nurse during the Civil War. And the Civil War was, quite a pivotal time for the idea of Christmas in America. So I think it was great to include that from her, to give a different version of Christmas than people might be expecting from Alcott. And I think also a figure like Robert Ingersoll, who I did not really think about in relation to this collection at all. He was famous as a lecturer and a writer who was known as the Great Agnostic. His whole thing was being a Gilded Age figure who was speaking out publicly against religion. So a figure that is already surprising to us, perhaps, as a 19th century figure, a kind of public atheist in that sense. And I was really surprised to find that he used Christmas a lot in his rhetoric. So it was a constant surprise, really. I think I had a sense of what this story looked like going in, but of course, once you start digging away, it starts to look very different.
Yeah, and I'm sure that, and that's I think what I love about that is you know, and I think a lot of people that pull together these anthologies, you didn't go in with any kind of rigid idea about what you wanted to do with this anthology. It seemed like you were very sort of, I mean, you had an idea of the breadth of time you wanted to cover, but you were sort of open to that. Okay, this is something that I may have read once a long time ago, or maybe I read the author, but I hadn't read all her stories. I thought that was an interesting point that you made about how you went into this anthology with almost an open mind, even though you were very familiar with a lot of the content.
Yeah, yeah, I certainly tried to. Yeah, thank you.
Conversely, and you know, you mentioned Little Women, but were there other stories that maybe one or two that you would love to have included, but maybe just didn't find the room or the space for it?
Yeah, inevitably, I guess, as you can imagine. So I didn't include The Night Before Christmas, Clement Clarke Moore, Visit from St. Nicholas in this because I think everybody knows it, although part of me still thinks that, maybe it should have been here just for a sense of completeness. But
Like on a record that you're discovering, right?
yes.
Nobody knows that
Um,
song to play it, but it is a classic.
yes, yes. Yeah, people can source that on their own, I think, probably. So that's good. And actually, the collection ends with this, I think, rather lovely account of Christmas in the Tenements, as it's called, by Jacob A. Riis,
Yes.
who's known for his kind of muckraking journalism, I guess, from the late 19th century. And he's another one who has an enormous number of Christmas writings, who really uses Christmas every year. And he's a figure who you could have included quite a few other stories from. Always really interesting kind of first person reportage, but some fiction as well, which I think is surprising. So I think that was the most evocative one of his Christmas writings, which is why I included it. It's a really panoramic view of Christmas in New York in 1897, amongst the poorer districts of the city. So I think it's a really interesting read. But again, he's a figure who every year was writing something, as a professional journalist, was writing something about Christmas.
For someone that has obviously never pulled together an anthology, can you explain? So if you discover a story and maybe it's in another collection or maybe it's in a magazine, how does that work as far as what's the process of decide? Okay, I'm
Yeah,
gonna, what do I have to do to include this story? What's the
yeah.
process?
Well, this is why I like working in the 19th century, because happily everything is out of copyright now. So everything that you can find is fair game for inclusion. The challenge is finding good copies of everything, copies that you can transcribe, that are the primary source, the first publication of these things. I think it's you always want to try and track down their first appearance. And luckily, we live in an era now where lots of stuff has been digitized, so that makes it much easier for me as a researcher, sitting in London, to be able to put together a collection of 19th century American short stories. And when stuff hasn't been digitized, thank goodness we have librarians, and librarians across America have been very helpful in lots of the editorial work I've done. And generally they'll be able to send you a scan of something if it doesn't exist easily online. So that's so the big part of it is making sure you can find a decent primary source, and then as long as you're before the copyright wall, you're you're off to the races.
And I think the other thing too that you just mentioned, that again, an anthology like this, and moving forward anthologies since the internet, the internet has got to be such an invaluable tool, not only for making the work easier, but also for discovery
Yeah.
of content that you might not otherwise know about.
Yeah.
I can't imagine, pulling together this anthology that you did pre-internet. And you would have, it would have been library work, but
Yeah.
how many of these stories might you not have
Yeah.
found without the internet?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, I always absolutely, take my hat off to researchers from previous generations when you come across their anthologies, because as you say, the time spent in libraries and archives, flipping through paper, must have been extraordinary. No keyword searches, no serendipitous Google accidents in those times. You would be it would be a different endeavor, absolutely. So I always pay respects to those who went before, who and that's how I wrote my first book. I think that was I was just about pre-internet, pre-digitization with that. So I do have some memory of that. But
The trauma.
yes, it's definitely changed the way I work. That is absolutely true. Yeah.
So one of your stated goals when you compiled this collection was to make sure that how many ways Christmas was used to support viewpoints
Mm.
during its evolution as a holiday. Can you talk about the link between Christmas and abolition, the abolition movement?
Yes, certainly. I think that's one of the first and most powerful ways that Christmas is employed in the 19th century as part of the significant arguments that are running through American life at that point. And yes, the abolitionist movement definitely takes up Christmas quite early on. So, for example, one of the first public Christmas trees in America is raised in Boston in the 1840s. As part of an abolitionist fundraising effort. And I think that's a really great, example of the way you can see that these two things became linked quite early, at least in the North, of course. And obviously very powerful is the way that Christmas was used as a theme, as a moment in lots of biographies written by formerly enslaved people who managed to leave bondage and then write autobiographies. So Christmas famously appears in Frederick Douglass's narrative, so I included that here, and in Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So I think rhetorically speaking, it was an important device for those anti-slavery writers as well, because Christmas is a time which emphasizes things like family, charity, and of course that presents quite a stark contrast to life for the enslaved at this time. So certainly I think you can see that the abolitionist movement really picks up Christmas as a literary device and as a fundraising device very early in the 1840s, and that carries on through the Civil War. So it doesn't feel coincidental, therefore, that before Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, she writes A Christmas Story. That seems very appropriate. But I guess also we need to remember that that was a two-sided coin in some senses, and equally early on in the debates around slavery in American life, the South was also attempting to use Christmas as a kind of propaganda tool, and would make the argument that the enslaved were given a few days off at Christmas, perhaps given some rudimentary gifts at Christmas, as a way of suggesting that the arguments made by abolitionists were overwrought, and that slavery really wasn't that bad as an institution. So, and that carries on, right through past the abolition of slavery as well. So immediately you can see that Christmas is absolutely embroiled in the major national conversation. Not long after it is developing into its recognizable modern form.
Yeah, I thought that was another really interesting point. Was there were, and I don't know why, but I didn't know this. Is not the kind of thing you think about until it's presented to you, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, of course, of course it was. But with Christmas, the idea that leading up to the Civil War and probably for a little bit afterwards, there were real regional differences between the North and the South view of how Christmas was viewed and how it should be celebrated, right? And can you just generally, aside from the very important subject of slavery and abolition, there were other differences, weren't there?
Yes, absolutely, and we can take that right back to the earliest colonial moments, really, in America. If we think about the North, we think about the famous accounts of Christmas that we get in William Bradford's journals from the earliest bits of New England colonial life. We need to remember, of course, that the Puritans of all sorts did not celebrate Christmas, and were very adamant about that. Christmas was made illegal in Britain during the English Civil War, after the English Civil War, before the Restoration, and Christmas was certainly suppressed in Puritan New England. In a way that really lasted. There was still a suspicion around Christmas, into the 19th century. And it wasn't until mid-century and after, really, that Christmas was accepted as a kind of ubiquitous celebration. in the north. Whereas in the south, there is this sense that it becomes embedded in social life a lot earlier. That Southerners take on that kind of merry old England mantle when it comes to Christmas. Or at least that's the understanding as it develops. And in the 19th century, Southern writers are quite keen to lay claim to the mantle of keeping Christmas, whilst their Puritan neighbours were still in opposition to it. So yeah, when it comes to that sense of regional identity, there is quite a powerful Christmas has a powerful role to play in shaping that sense of identity and also opposition as well. The idea that here we have two groups who are actually kind of in some senses carrying on the arguments of Britain in the 17th century. You've got Puritan versus Cavalier, and you've got Scrooge-like refusal of Christmas in opposition to a kind of a very kind of jolly celebration framed around kind of feudal good cheer, essentially.
And it came right down to things like the difference between Santa Claus and Father Christmas, right?
Yeah. During the Civil War, there certainly is a bit of that. I mean, William Gilmore Simms tries to dismiss Santa Claus as a little Manhattan goblin, and Santa does get co-opted into the Civil War in that sense as well. I mean, we should remember that it's in 1863, so right in the middle of the war, in Harper's Weekly, that Thomas Nast draws his first cartoon of Santa Claus giving out presents to Union troops. So, and in some senses, we think of Nast as providing the defining images of Santa Claus in mid-century into the 1880s. So even that is rooted in essentially what is a propaganda image from 1863. So yes, it's absolutely wrapped in there.
So what you're saying is Christmas was being weaponized even back in the 1860s.
I mean, go back to the 1620s if you like. Yeah, I mean, we can go right back. Yeah, Christmas has never not been weaponized. I think it's fair to say, and in the run up to and during the Civil War in America is probably the moment that it has been most weaponized in propaganda terms.
So let's talk a little bit about Charles Dickens, because he played such a major role in the growth of Christmas. Obviously with the publication of A Christmas Carol in 1843, but as you point out, it was not initially greeted with particular warmth in America. Apparently there were some hurt feelings among the colonists. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yes, certainly. So we need to remember that in 1842, Charles Dickens comes to America. He comes on a tour. He's going to write a book about America, which is quite a popular thing for European writers to do at this point, try and take stock of what's happening across the Atlantic. And he arrives as a literary celebrity, right? It's quite a big deal that Dickens is coming to America at this point. And so he's generally feted. People are very keen to meet him. Lots of parties thrown for him. He meets the great and the good. The problem starts when Dickens goes back to Britain and writes his travel account of what he found in America, American Notes, published in 1842, and he was not entirely complimentary about what he found in America. I'm sad to say. I think he went with a really utopian sense of what American society and American life would be like. So I think some of that disillusion is what creeps into his travel account of America. And America was not happy. It's fair to say. Having been an enormously popular literary celebrity, Dickens becomes something of a public enemy after the publication of that book. And of course, it's in the immediate wake of that he then turns to Christmas in A Christmas Carol, published in 1843, which gets its first release in America about a month later, in January 1844. Although, America, you could argue, has a part to play in that as well, because it always seems timely that when Dickens is in America in 1842, one of the literary celebrities that he meets is Washington Irving. And Dickens is a big fan of Irving. He specifically gives a speech while he's in America and talks about how much he enjoys Irving's work. says something to the effect that, where Irving has been is where, we all follow in a sense. He paves the way. And of course, Washington Irving is one of the writers that we can credit for really bringing back Christmas as a literary theme. In the extracts I include in this account, where he really, lavished attention on the idea of old English Christmas. So you could say that Washington Irving was an inspiration on Dickens, and it's interesting that when he gets back to Britain after spending time with Washington Irving, that's when he first turns to Christmas as a major theme. But yes, unfortunately, the chilling effect of his travel account meant that A Christmas Carol was not immediately embraced. Certainly reviewers were positive, but there was definitely a reservation still. And I think it didn't receive the acclaim it might have received had it not been for Dickens' unkind comments about life in America that had just gone before it. But it embeds itself still, I think, in American reading lives. Dickens is still popular, and it's adapted pretty much immediately for the stage. And of course, then Dickens follows that with a number of other Christmas books, and they find a place in the reading lives of Americans. But I think the real revolution takes place a bit later, in 1867, when Dickens finally goes back to America after a period of 25 years and gives a reading tour. And he arrives in America late in the year. So this reading tour kind of spans over Christmas as a period. Yeah, and one of the readings that he gives most while he's in America is his version of A Christmas Carol. So that really, I think, helps to cement the status of A Christmas Carol as a real festive classic. And there's a lot of merchandise that spins off from this tour that helps that as well. So American publishers are producing numerous editions of A Christmas Carol, lavishly illustrated, designed as gift books. So I think that's the time that really that means A Christmas Carol really claims its place in the American festive imagination.
And it was 3 years later, 1870, you talk about that as a seminal year for the holiday. Obviously Dickens passes, and the holiday is nationalized by Ulysses Grant with a piece of legislation that includes New Year's, July 4th, and Thanksgiving. But there was more than that, right? Those were part of it, but there were other factors in elevating Christmas, or sort of altering, or how would you describe it and why?
I think so. Yeah, you can definitely use 1870 when Dickens dies as a kind of pivot moment in a sense for Christmas in America, or at least maybe you could take that as the date when it really becomes enshrined as a national thing that's a unifying thing as well. We're post Civil War, so America is looking for kind of moments of unity, and I think 1870 is a good point to date the idea of Christmas as a ubiquitous and unifying celebration from. Puritan reservations in the North have kind of dried up over various generations by that point, and there is a sense that America is unified in its celebration of Christmas at this point. So that's certainly one thing. I think you could say that the commercialization of Christmas has probably reached a particular point by 1870. So Christmas trees have become far more common in people's lives. Gift giving has become very much cemented in the seasonal life of people, and recognizably modern things like Macy's decorates its Christmas windows in 1874 for the first time. So the department store shops are really leaning into capturing that Christmas market in the way that we can recognize as modern. And in literary terms as well, I think lots of interesting things are happening at that point. So in that post-war moment, 1870 onwards, let's say, you get a real explosion in children's literature, right? You get what we would think of as a golden age in children's literature. And that really helps to fuel certain visions of Christmas.
Sure.
So, for example, in 1873, you get the foundation of St. Nicholas magazine, which is absolutely the premier children's literature journal of the era. It really helps to redefine children's literature as its own particular art form, one which is, engaging for adults as well as children. Its editor, Mary Mapes Dodge, gets all of the famous writers of the day who would probably not previously have thought about writing for children. She kind of strong arms them into writing for this children's literary magazine. And of course, it takes its name from Santa Claus, right? So immediately it kind of advertises the idea that Christmas and children and childhood are profoundly linked. And in its pages and in the pages of its rival children's literary magazines, each year, again, stories of Santa and Christmas, of course, proliferate. And on the other hand of that, you also get a new generation of writers who start paying attention to Christmas, but in a way that's informed by kind of modern movements in literature at this point, and particularly the kind of development of American literary realism. So you have a figure like William Dean Howells, who's obviously one of the most important literary figures in American history, who is helping to promote the development of a realist style in American letters as both editor and writer. And so you get lots of writers who are kind of moving away from a previous kind of more sentimental style of writing to trying to think about the way that Christmas plays out in the lives of Americans in a way that's perhaps a bit more embedded in their real lives. So you get a real flourishing of Christmas writing at this point, which is trying to do something new, is experimental, is pushing forward in literary terms, as well as capturing that Christmas market.
And you make an interesting point about, how, and now that you mentioned it, or now that I've noticed it after you called attention to it, but if you start to look for it, you can find references to Christmas throughout literature. And you made a great point about, just look at Moby Dick. The Pequod leaves on Christmas Day. Just references. Why do you think that was? And it just seems like the holiday and literature were sort of tied together as they both evolved.
Yes, definitely. I mean, partly because it's a popular theme. I mean, it's
symbolic. It's got a symbolism that's easily applicable, right? In a lot of.
I think that's right. Yeah. It's symbolically rich, so you can do lots of things with it. You can play with its meaning and its symbolism. And yes, as I say, it's popular theme. So writers are kind of encouraged to write about Christmas because editors are going to pay more money for Christmas stories. And I think that in a sense that was why Christmas literature has been neglected, I would say, amongst literary historians, because there was that sense that in a sense, it was driven by those kind of commercial motives. But, I think in a sense that's not what's at play in most of these stories, I think. I think they're using a popular theme, but all of the ones included here certainly are doing something much more interesting with it than simply attempting to cash in on a Christmas trend. I mean, some writers really hated it as well. There's a great quote from Anthony Trollope, the British novelist, from his autobiography, where he's lamenting the fact that he's got to write another Christmas story and how painful he finds it, having to trying to drum up that kind of Christmas spirit in the middle of summer, which is, of course, with deadlines, etc., when most writers had to write their Christmas stories. So it wasn't for everyone in a sense. But then you find a writer like Mary Wilkins Freeman, for example, who something else is going on there apart from just a pure commercial motive, because the way that she's able to find inspiration in apparently a limited range of themes each year, is quite remarkable. It's all part and parcel of it. But yes, once you start looking, it absolutely does pop up everywhere and in unexpected places.
I thought the other thing too, and again, this is something that as you grow up, you hear all about, oh, Christmas has become so commercialized, and it wasn't like this back in the old days, and what we've lost our way with the meaning of Christmas and all of that. But as you start to look back, Christmas, obviously going back, it certainly to the rise of the department stores, as they progressed and evolved, they were looking for ways to move their goods during the winter time. But this idea that Christmas was once not commercialized, that there was a time where there were these magical, seasonal celebration. It's kind of a myth, isn't it?
Yes, I think in a sense, if there's one one dominant theme of Christmas writing.
As somebody who paged through the Sears and Roebuck catalog, looking for
Uh-huh.
a little kid, it always makes me feel better to know that no, it actually was never not convenient.
I mean, in a sense, if there is one dominant theme across Christmas writing throughout the 19th century, that is it. But it's always there was a time when things weren't commercialized that we can think of as a golden age. And I mean, in a sense, that's what brings about, on some level anyway, the Christmas revival of the 19th century. Now, if we look at what Washington Irving does early in the century, and other writers like around at the same time, like Walter Scott, what they are saying is, oh, this, once upon a time, Christmas was a golden age where
Right.
people gathered together, where the great and the good opened their big houses, and the poor were brought in and fed, and so that kind of feudal charity was dominant, and feasting took place everywhere. So immediately, right, when Christmas is resurged in the 19th century, it's backwards looking. It's already saying there was a better time than this, right? And then as soon as you get to Christmas becoming a more dominant theme in American literary culture, you can immediately see as well that kind of lament for a time before the commercialization of Christmas, which is in a sense, it's like, looking for a time that really did never exist, because that kind of modern Christmas wasn't a thing before commercialization. They go hand in hand. So if think about that Harriet Beecher Stowe story from 1850, it begins with the protagonist saying, "Oh, I can't believe it! It's Christmas again. I've got to think about what to buy everyone. Oh, it's so tiring." And there's even a great quote from Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we might not think about as a particularly festive figure. From the 1840s, puzzling over the fact that whenever it's time to buy someone a Christmas present, he doesn't know what to get them, and then the time has passed. So this is absolutely something which is a dominant theme of literary Christmases.
We're getting close on time here, but there's a couple things I want to touch on really quickly. Can you talk a little bit about the Santa paradox, which I think is a really fascinating, as Santa evolved?
Yes, so the Santa paradox, yeah, I like it. By which I think you mean the idea that Santa emerges as a distinctive American gift bringer in the 1820s. People start writing about him, people start thinking about him, and as he becomes a really popular and ubiquitous figure in American life, people have to tangle with the fact that children are told that Santa Claus will bring you presents if you're good. But of course, plenty of rich children who aren't particularly good will get lots of presents, and plenty of poor children who have been paragons of virtue won't receive presents. And that's certainly an interesting facet, I think, of American literary Christmases, that trying to work around that. How do we justify, in a sense, the fact that Santa Claus is this benevolent gift bringer who nonetheless might not visit all the poor children, and they might end up with empty stockings. So yeah, I think writers answer that in different ways, but generally the call is for charity, right? To make sure that if Santa Claus can't get to everyone, if poor children are unable to write him a letter and tell him what they want, then it needs to be the case that other people take the place of Santa and do that job for Santa. And sometimes late in the century that took pretty proactive, active, real world activities kind of spiraled out of that. So, for example, the New York Evening World sponsored Christmas trees every year in seven places around New York, where poor children would be given presents after the readers of that newspaper sent in funds to help sponsor it. And that was only one example of many where that kind of sense of public communal gift giving at Christmas really became a thing in the late 19th century. It was a distinctive part of the Gilded Age, actually.
And the other point that I think is fascinating in this, and again, it's my own ignorance, but I've seen the movie Ben-Hur. I know about the Races and Charlton Heston. I had no idea that Ben-Hur, the novel, had such a significant impact on the evolution of Christmas. Can you just touch, again, briefly, I know there's more to this story, but can you touch a little bit about what the impact Ben-Hur had on?
Yes, I think Ben-Hur is pivotal when it comes out, because up until that point, 1880, yeah. Up until that point, there was still a certain amount of suspicion around celebrating Christmas for some religious Americans, because of that Puritan prohibition on Christmas. And I think Ben-Hur, because it begins, if you haven't read the novel, you're probably not aware of this, but you can read it in this collection. It begins with a really evocative passage around the Nativity. It starts with the three wise men, and it gives you, for in not necessarily the first time, but in a way that was enormously popular. Ben-Hur was a massive bestseller. It gives a dramatization of the Nativity in a way that we're very familiar with now, but in a way that I think Americans in the 1880 weren't familiar with. So I really think that text helped to put, in a sense, Christianity back into Christmas, which I think is an interesting thing, because people would have assumed that Christianity was front and center in Christmas before 1880. But really, I think that really helped to kickstart a religious revival around Christmas in this period.
That was inspired by the inspiration for that novel.
Yes.
It's an interesting story as well.
Yes, I mean, I think that was one of the remarkable things that I came across putting this book together that I had no idea. I mentioned Robert Ingersoll before, who was, in a sense, this lecturer and writer who was a public atheist at a time when there were not many public atheists. And it so happened that he actually bumped into Lew Wallace on a train journey when they were both headed to a reunion of Union troops.
Wallace, Ben-Hur.
Yeah. Wallace and Ingersoll were both headed to the same Civil War reunion, and they started talking to each other. And Wallace, inevitably talking to Ingersoll, he got onto religion, and Wallace was really shaken by Ingersoll's atheism. He was completely shocked by it, but he also felt like he didn't have enough ammunition, in a sense, to argue back in as full-throated a way as he wanted to. And it was that conversation with Ingersoll that inspired him to go and do some biblical research and ultimately write Ben-Hur. So it's very nice to have them next to each other in this collection, because they're both enormously significant, I think, on the trajectory of Christmas.
I'm so embarrassed that I did not realize Ben-Hur was actually a novel, and that it was actually written in 1880. Again, that's one of, there's a million of these kinds of revelations in this collection, and it's just such a wonderful collection. We're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you about your new book project. You're returning once again to the subject of Christmas.
Yes, it's the gift that keeps on giving, Christmas. Yes, at the moment I'm putting together a collection of Santa Claus stories from the 19th century. So a collection purely focused on the development of Santa as a figure in American culture, global culture. Probably one of the biggest global icons out there. But in this collection, we'll be able to see him take shape on the page throughout American literature. So I think it should be a good companion to these other anthologies. And
your books are all published by LSU.
Yes, those first two are. This one will have a different publisher, but yes, like Christmas Past and the Mary Wilkins Freeman collection are both Louisiana State University Press.
So they can order it online. They can find those online to order if after listening to this fascinating interview, if you're driven to do that, you can go online and find these books. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an enjoyable hour. And it could be an enjoyable multiple hours here. You'll have to promise when your new book comes out, you'll climb down the chimney and join us.
I'd love to. That'd be great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.